My dear, be a good man, be virtuous, be religious, be a good man. Nothing else will give you any comfort when you come to lie here. Scott's dying words are, as recounted by J.G. Lockhart in his Life of Scott, gained widespread credence and admiration in the Victorian era, and with their intimation of Scott's own personal goodness, might be said to have been well calculated to achieve just that goal. Among other places, they feature as something of a hardy perennial in post-Lockhart biographies, allowing for Scott one final moment of grandiloquence, while providing the biographers with a convenient way of rounding off their own narratives. A late example here can be found in John Buchan's Sir Walter Scott, 1932, where Lockhart is depicted as being called to Scott's bedside and finding him conscious again, but in the last extremity of weakness, the words then being aired in full and unquestioned. As the new century progressed, however, these words came to be increasingly seen as a fabrication, and indeed might be regarded as the first of a series of Lockhartian inventions to bite the dust. In general terms, their supposed piety faced a more hostile audience, one, if in maintaining any interest in last words, likely to prioritise irreverent over official versions, George V's Bugger Bogner over How is the Empire. Furthermore, enhanced access by scholars to relevant correspondence made it more clear that for much of the journey back from Italy to home, Scott was in a comatose state, and in his final weeks at Abbotsford, largely unable to express himself and reportedly prone to long screaming episodes. In this light, the Lockhart balloon would no doubt have spluttered out unaided, but a more decisive pinprick was applied by H.J.C. Grierson's revelation in his 1938 biography that this pious myth came as the result of an appeal from a lady relative of Scott's. Without revealing the identity of the said lady, Grierson quoted her words in full. "When you write anything of the last very melancholy weeks at Abbotsford, I think it will be most valuable to mention any of the few remarks he muttered when his mind was clear of a religious tendency, such as I heard occasionally, 'Oh, be virtuous, it is one's only comfort in a dying state,' and anything of that kind, for there are wicked people who will take a pleasure in saying that he was not a religious man, and proving the contrary will do much good." Following biographers have generally swallowed Grierson's accusation whole, while in the process the lady relative has morphed into an evangelical one. Thus John Sutherland refers to an evangelical lady asking Lockhart to confect a pious scene and dialogue just like this, while adding that the probability is that Scott never regained consciousness in his last days. Nowadays, the term evangelical is more than likely to conjure up an image of a puritanical neo-Victorian Mrs. Grundy, intent in this case on applying a heavy glossing of piety over Scott's more secular spirit. In fact, nothing could be further from truth. As Grierson well knew, the person in question was no other than Mrs. Harriet Scott, one of Scott's longest-standing friends, the wife of his neighbour and clan chief, Hugh, Laird of Harden, and a formidable woman in her own right. The daughter of Count Hans Moritz von Brühl, Saxon ambassador to the court of St. James, Harriet had married Hugh Scott in September 1795, about which time she evidently sat for this portrait by Raeburn. In a letter of August, Scott viewed with excitement the prospect of the great marriage between Scott of Harden and the daughter of Count Brühl, the famous chess player, and the likelihood of their returning shortly to the Harden seat at Merton House in the Borders. "I wish they may come down soon, as we shall have fine racketing, of which I will probably get my share." 2 years later, it was to the Hardens that Scott naturally turned for support in forwarding his own plans for marriage, as he confided to his wife-to-be Charlotte, "I went to Mertoun yesterday in order to talk over the most interesting subject which can ever engage me with Mr. and Mrs. Scott. You will like Mrs. Scott much." Harriet was also instrumental in encouraging Scott's literary ambitions, procuring for him German texts which helped make his early translations possible. In all, some 40 letters from Scott to Harriet have survived, mostly available to Grierson, though only 12 of these appear in his edition of the letters. Now deposited in the National Records of Scotland, these papers also contain a number of Scott manuscript poems, including the until recently unpublished 4-stanza poem beginning "Of old, when vassals to their head," dedicated to Charles Walter Scott, the Hardens' eldest child, born in 1796, who was to die prematurely, aged 9, and in which Scott evokes the spirit of the old border robber Scotts of Harden, from whom he felt descended. Notwithstanding this hectic patriarchy, in the lines, "Shall painting raise her glowing hand and stretch her buckler o'er the muse," it is hard not to sense the presence of Harriet, whose skill as an artist was later to be noted by Scott when writing to her at some length from Naples in March 1832. After Scott's move to Abbotsford in 1812, relationships between the families became even closer. Conversations with Hugh usually concerned local affairs, turnpikes, gaslighting, the career of his eldest surviving son, Henry, who became MP for Roxburghshire. But on social occasions, the Hardens regularly featured as a couple, and one has a strong feeling that the presiding spirit was Harriet. Together they showed a knack of being there when it mattered, visiting Scott's mother shortly before her death, and then arriving at Abbotsford in May 1826 when Charlotte was on her deathbed. In widowhood, Merton provided one of Scott's strongest refuges, and his remaining Christmases were regularly spent with the Hardens. In particular, Harriet shows signs of wanting to provide protection for Scott's younger daughter, Anne, who had suffered badly through her mother's death and father's insolvency. One feature of this evidently was church attendance. Scott, in a letter to his son Walter on 24th of December 1830, mentioning how Anne goes to Merton to go with Mrs. Scott to chapel tomorrow at Kelso. This must refer to St Andrew's Chapel, originally the home of a qualified congregation under an Anglican priest, which in 1826 had become part of the newly amalgamated Scottish Episcopal Church. At this point, it is worth concentrating on a single family occasion in which matters concerning religion, death, bereavement, as well as Scott's own poetry writing combined dynamically. The starting point came with the death of the Reverend George William Scott, fourth son of the Hardens, which Scott first heard of through a letter of 11 June 1830 from the deceased brother Henry, reporting, "Your old favourite George has been carried off by a severe typhus fever." Scott's sadness is reflected in a journal entry of 15 June. "Poor dear boy, I am sorry for him and yet more so for his parents." Later in September, Harriet wrote to Scott asking if he would pen an inscription for a commemorative tablet in Kentisbere Church near Exeter, where George had been rector. On previous occasions, Scott had found the production of such funerary pieces as burdensome, but in this instance, and perhaps with an accentuated sense of his own mortality, he accepted the task as one close to his heart. The result is the inscription for the monument to the Reverend George Scott, which appears as item 131 in our recently published EEWSP volume of the shorter poems. Scott duly sent Harriet his epitaph, volunteering to have it pointed and printed by James Ballantyne, an offer which she accepted, though retaining the manuscript and sending back her own handwritten copy for the purpose. As a result, it is possible to trace a number of changes in the penultimate line, where Scott had originally written sorrowing before altering this to murmuring, but let submission tame each murmuring thought, which Harriet misinterpreted, probably through misreading, as mourning. All printed versions prior to EEWSP then reverting to Scott's original sorrowing, which at least scans better. Supposedly small changes can sometimes reveal a lot. Scott's revision to murmuring proves to be both deliberate and biblically informed. the expression denoting a faithless questioning of God's purpose, as by those in Psalm 106, who murmured in their tents and hearkened not to the word of the Lord. While apparently less theologically astute here than Scott, Harriet was no doubt gratified by the end result, and also by having in her possession the holograph of what she firmly believed to be Scott's last poetical lines. To what extent might Scott himself be considered religious? His Presbyterian upbringing through attendance at Old Greyfriars, where his father was an elder, undoubtedly left its mark. Two of his earliest poems, On a Thunderstorm and On the Setting Sun, written while a pupil at the high school, strongly echo nonconformist texts such as Isaac Watts' metrical Psalms of David. In his early married life, there are signs of an affiliation to the qualified Episcopalianism of the day, though the prime mover in matters such as baptisms appears to have been Charlotte. A rekindled attraction to Catholicism might seem to underlie his own desire to be buried in the grounds of Dryburgh Abbey, but in this case the main driving force appears to have been a long-held desire to uphold an ancestral right belonging to his forebears, the Haliburtons. As to his own practice, there are scant references to attendance at church. All the signs are, like some others of us, that he preferred to work on Sunday. The journal contains at least one reference to Sunday prayers being read at Abbotsford, and such was definitely the case when he and Anne visited Mertoun. On a parallel front, there is evidence enough of Scott's knowledge of the convention of last words. The belief that such have special value on the grounds that no one on the point of death is likely to varnish the truth is long-standing. Scott, too, was well apprised of the main traditions which fed into the convention: classical antiquity, Christian martyrdom, the last speeches of condemned criminals, dying words of celebrated statesmen, and more recently still, those of literary figures. In the latter instance, the words attributed to George Lyttelton by Johnson in Lives of the Poets seem particularly close. Be good, be virtuous, my lord, you must come to this. The novels are filled with dramatic last expostulations, notable among them Fergus MacIvor's defiant "God save King James." These were the last words which Waverley heard him speak. Scott's personal records likewise show a fascination for last words in his own time. One well-known instance occurs in the Asher Steele memoir, with the demise of his old high school teacher, Alexander Adam. But it grows dark, the boys may dismiss, this fitting in with a category in which a ruling passion expresses itself for one last time. The journal in turn is flecked with observations on the growing number of passing friends and as well as assorted notorieties. Perhaps the most revealing example of all there, however, occurs with Charlotte's death in 1826. According to Anne, in a letter to her sister Sophia, he, the doctor, came to the bed and said she was gone. Mamma said in a soft, sweet voice, "No," and that breath was the last. Scott was away on court business, and the famous journal entry on seeing her corpse came subsequently. This is then followed by another entry in which Scott appears as if psychologically compelled to recall fitting words. "I remembered the last sight of her. She raised herself in bed and said with a sort of smile, 'You all have such melancholy faces.' These were the last words I heard her utter." Imagined or real, the words here fit another common trope, whereby the dying person shows more concern for others than themselves. The incident also contains more than the suggestion that last words can have more relevance for survivors than for the dying. It is worth considering the extent to which Scott might have rehearsed last words for himself during his later years. In one sense, it might even be claimed that the journal itself represents one concerted final statement, while its entries are flecked with momentary considerations of what he would like to be able to say or have said about him, as well as growing apprehensions that he might not be able to say anything at all. Another source is found in the last short poems he wrote, reflecting a variety of responses as his hopes were eroded by insolvency, his wife's death, and the succession of strokes. One late instance is the relatively well-known lines written in Dora Wordsworth's album of September 1831, in which, after rather impressively comparing the Wordsworthian gifted eye with his present palsied state, Scott falls back on a not too convincing, at least for us, valedictory Tory patriotism. In his journal entry, Scott feared he had made an ill-favoured botch, and according to Wordsworth, he had remarked, "They are probably the last verses I shall ever write." Scott's actual last lines, however, are found in his verses written at the request of the Countess Wolensky, a Russian lady, most probably composed in Naples in spring 1832, and of which 3 fragmentary versions have survived, from which the last item in the shorter poems volume is reconstituted. Two features are especially worth noting. One is the continuing accuracy of Scott's biblical memory. The first 2 lines of the second stanza, "Mortals in vain, so says the text, seek grapes from briars, from thistles corn," recalling Matthew 7:16, "Do men gather grapes of thorn or figs of thistle?" While the last 2, "The shades upon the dial cast proceed but pass not back again," allude to the Old Testament legend in which the dying Hezekiah is offered a choice of the shadow on the sundial being moved forward or backwards. Also noteworthy is the solitary "and" at the final line, "The stiffened fingers take the pen and," whereby a hiatus stretches into a void. Insofar as written testimony is concerned, this itself might lay claim to represent Scott's true last word. To return to those final weeks at Abbotsford, where Scott was tended to primarily by his daughters along with Lockhart. The primary witnesses for Scott's wild behaviour then, it should be noted, are Anne and Sophia, both of whom themselves were under extreme pressure. A somewhat different perspective, however, is provided by William Laidlaw, who had guarded Abbotsford during Scott's absence and was clearly considered as something as a rock by the various participants. According to his record, Scott had recognised him after his arrival and continued to do so for some time. In a letter of late July, he reports how Sir Walter is generally collected in the morning and very restless and troublesome to his daughters during the afternoon and night, often raving, but always quiet, and generally showing command of himself when Lockhart comes in. A further glimpse of the relationship between Scott and Lockhart is found in a hitherto unknown letter of Laidlaw's reporting Scott's death on the 21st of September 1832 to his brother George. Laidlaw here describes how on one of the final days, most probably Monday the 17th is meant, Scott had awoken more collected than he had been for a long time, allowing Lockhart to conclude some business relating to his salary as sheriff. Mr. Lockhart came to read the receipt to him, and he sat up in the bed and made a cross for his name with his left hand. Among Laidlaw's other correspondence at this time was Harriet Scott, who on the 11th of September had written anxiously, "In the expectation that our excellent friend's sufferings have come to a close, in the hope that he is rewarded for all the good that he did in life." Lockhart in his life mentions Harriet as one of several close female relations who tended Scott for a day or 2 at a time. Certainly, if Scott had indeed made remarks of a religious tendency, Harriet was in a good position to have heard them, nor in view of her other qualities do I believe that she could have easily made them up. Which leads back to Lockhart and the issue of words being deliberately planted or fabricated by him. Whatever his alleged failings, Lockhart did have the advantage of being there, and virtually for the entire duration. Certainly his larger account rings true on a number of fronts, as in the case of the tenacity of Scott's biblical memory compared with his failure to recollect the modern poetry of Crabbe. To give just one other example, the small detail of Scott's appearing to remember perfectly his grandson Walter's repetition of some of Dr. Watts' hymns brings to mind Scott's own childhood poems, as previously noted. The context given for the alleged last words on Monday the 17th of September is also close to that in Laidlaw's letter to George, which Lockhart is unlikely to have known about. The dramatic incidents with which Lockhart is prone to punctuate his biography, the unceasing hand finishing Waverley and Castle Street that Lockhart could not possibly have seen, for example, have met with justifiable scepticism from scholars. But many of the stories have persisted, aided arguably by their containing a real kernel of truth. At the risk of sounding overgrand, one might even invoke Werner Herzog's distinction between accountant's reality and ecstatic truth, with Lockhart, in the present instance, piecing together fragments from what had previously been uttered, or even formulating what Scott would have said if he could. In one respect, Scott might have been wondering whether he himself had been a good man. In another, he had more than enough cause for hoping that Lockhart would prove one. As early as 1820, he had come to the conclusion that it was Lockhart, rather than his own sons, who was best equipped to manage his literary interests. The letters and journal are also filled with moments where Scott is found advising Lockhart to put aside satirical leanings to advance a more stable literary career. At the time of the death, too, the Lockharts alone had provided offspring to carry on the family succession, which was so dear to Scott's heart. Lockhart was also clearly Scott's designated heir, so as far as carrying on his public legacy. With a new edition of Lockhart in progress, it is perhaps timely now to reassess how near he might have come to honouring such a hidden injunction in Scott's last words. And finally, some last words of my own, thanks to the marvellous Lee Simpson for directing this video.